Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider, a priest of the Legions of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the Starcross Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 155, and we're covering Prophetic Cure Tactics 20 to 22 on the governance of religious and their ministries. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican and frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday I talked about the importance of the habit of renewal and of culture, of a new community having purpose. Now today, it was hard to summarize the three numbers is coherent because they're each talking about a very different thing, so I'll just give you a summary of each number. 20, religious need to do the proper apostolate as missionaries. 21, how to deal with communities that are dying. 22, and federations of independent monasteries. So, paragraph 20 is the only one with subparagraphs that has subparagraphs A and B. A is about each community needs to maintain the ministries, but also should adapt, that kind of tension in there. And B is about how we as religious are always missionaries, right? Even if we're in a place that's not considered mission territory, we are missionaries, right? So, I'm recording this from Connecticut, USA, and although we'd think of Connecticut as one of the most Catholic states in the U.S., it is a state that definitely needs some evangelization in a lot of things, how it operates, right? So, let's start with 20A. Religious communities should continue to maintain and fulfill their ministries proper to them. In addition, after considering the needs of the universal church and the individual diocese, they should adapt them to the requirements of time and place, employing appropriate and even new programs, and abandoning those works which they are less relevant to the spirit and authentic nature of community. Right? So each community has a proper ministry. Right? Maybe they teach, maybe they run a hospital, maybe they're just a contemplative community whose main ministry is prayer, right? And sometimes it's like a mode of doing ministry, not a specific ministry, right? You look at the Jesuits, it's all about the Ignatian spirituality, ad majorem Dei gloriam, to the greater glory of God, and about Ignatian discernment and that, and then they can do various different ministries. The same thing with my community. It's about forming apostles. There's various different ministries that legionaries do, right? Like a lot of us form apostles together with Regnum Christi. I myself work in a Dawson seminary, and I form Dawson priests, right? And well, some other religious priests there actually too. But that's forming apostles. That's fulfilling the mission of my community, right? And then we also need to be ready to adapt, right? So certain communities have adapted historically, right? So, for example, the Trinitarians and Mercedarians were founded to ransom Christians who were enslaved by Muslims of North Africa. And you know what? That's not a thing that they're doing anymore. They've adapted to other ministries, right? Or other communities were formed in specific places, and now they've expanded, right? And they've expanded or modified slightly, but keeping that same spirit, right? And that's valuable in a community, right? And this is not abandoning the core. This is trying to find in the core what with our core can we do today that can help save souls. So let's move on to 20B about us always being missionaries. Us as in religious. So let's read it. The missionary spirit must, under all circumstances, be preserved in religious communities. It should be adapted accordingly as the nature of each community persists to modern conditions, so that the preaching of the gospel may be carried out more effectively in every nation. Right? So zeal is key, right? I think missionary spirit and zeal, apostolic zeal, are basically synonymous, right? Because we as priests, we as religious, we need to have that zeal. Hey, I want to go and save souls. I want to bring people to Jesus. I want people to know, love, and serve him, right? And that's like the core, the key of our mission. And then many are missionaries in this modern or post-Christian world, right? And we've had a post-Christian world in a way since the World Wars. A lot of the things we have today with post-Christianity really stem back to the World Wars and the kind of wanton destruction that happened at that point, right? And I think a lot of times people were complacent about a Christian culture. Oh, this is a Christian culture. We don't really need to evangelize. It's already fully evangelized. It's like 97% Catholic. And then they got complacent. And I think some of that complacency is some of what led into a lot of the issues after Vatican II, where people were kind of complacent about being Catholic, right? And so instead of being Catholic because of an encounter with Jesus, or Catholic because, oh, I'm Italian, I'm Quebecois, whatever else. No, We are Catholic because of Jesus, not because we're this or that nationality. And we can get into complacency there, even today, both religious and non-religious. And I think it's even more damaging for us as religious, because then we are most of all needing to present that world beyond, that life with Jesus. And then zeal leads us to preach to people today, right? So that's what we're talking about. So moving on to paragraph 21, it talks about how to deal with communities that are dying. So let's read the text. There may be communities and monasteries which the Holy See, after consulting the interested ordinaries, will judge not to possess reasonable hope for further development. These should be forbidden to receive novices in the future. If it is possible, these should be combined with other more flourishing communities and monasteries whose scope and spirit is similar. So a few little terms here to make it clear. So the local ordinaries are the bishops, or those who hold the equivalent of the bishop. In certain cases, like 98% of Catholics are going to be the bishop or the eparch if you're Eastern Catholic. But there are certain rare cases where mission territories, a priest might have that role, or in certain places the abbot of the monastery has that role. But that's not really, just think of it as the local bishop. And then when we talk about receiving novices, that's how we admit new members to the community. So it's basically saying you can't admit new members, right? And it's important to note that there are communities that have come for a time, done a lot of good, made saints and everything else, and not really continued for forever, right? So the Benedictine monasteries are one of the main forms of monastic life in our Western church, right? Probably the main form, the biggest form, right? And there was a subset of those called the Cluniac monasteries, based out of the monastery at Cluny, France, which was the second largest, their chapel was the second largest church in Christendom after St. Peter's at the time. And it was like the main type of monastery of Western Europe. And there aren't any Cluniac monasteries anymore, right? So that there was a set of reforms that did a lot, built a lot of saints. There's a whole bunch of a number of the abbots of Cluny were saints. And then I think there's others who were in Cluniac monasteries who were saints. And the fact that Cluniac monasteries don't exist anymore is not an indictment of them being saints. No. Those monasteries were for that time. They saved those souls then, and now we've moved on to other forms of monastic life, right? And there's several reasons for collapse. Really, there's mainly two: not attracting members or issues of the community. And I think it's important when we talk about not attracting members. There are two types. There's certain types like the Cluniacs where, hey, that charism might not be called for anymore, right? And there's other types where the people don't live the charism, right? And I'm not going to get into specific communities, what they did. There's multiple communities of sisters right now who have stopped accepting new members. They've stopped accepting novices, not because the Holy See told them, but because they realize on their own that, the youngest member is 50 years old or something, and it's going to be tough. We have a 30-year gap between the youngest and second youngest members and things like that, right? And once you get to that point, it's actually the prudential decision. As much as it's kind of disappointing, and you might look back and say, oh, maybe they should have done something else to promote vocations 20 years beforehand. But once you get to the point where your youngest member is 50, 60 years old, it's hard to put on like a few new members and say, hey, like we're going to put this whole burden on you. No, that's a challenge. And there was a move after the French Revolution to form a lot of female religious communities that just responded to the needs of a particular diocese on a strong charism. And a lot of these communities have folded in the last 50, 100 years, or are in the process of doing so, right? And maybe that's a sense of God pulling, God had that for that time and not for forever, kind of like the Cluniacs, right? And this is not to say bad about them. I have a great aunt who is a member of one of these communities. She might even be a saint. I might write about her sometime. I don't think I've really written about her much. I've only shown photos when I was like, at her funeral or at her 60th anniversary of profession. Anyways, and then there are communities that have issues, right? So, for example, the Holy See, sometimes when they're investigating a community, will restrict them from receiving novices. For example, at the moment I'm recording this, the Institute of the Incarnate Word, Instituto Verbo Incarnato, IVEs, are under such a thing while the Holy See investigates them and tries to oversee them and tries to put them in line with what the church wants. So they're not a bad community. It's not a horrible community, but they had some issues that they need to resolve if they want to follow the spirit of the church. Not going into details here. Anyway, so paragraph 22 is talking about federations of independent monasteries. So let's read the text. Independent institutions and monasteries should, when opportunities in the Holy See permits, form federations that can be considered as belonging to the same religious family. Others who have practically identical constitutions and rules and a common spirit should unite, particularly when they have a few members. Finally, those who share the same or very similar postulates should become associated one to the other. Right? So there's two main groups of religions as far as structure and organization. So they would all start out the same, but once they get larger, there's two different ways it can expand, right? So monasteries like Benedictines, things like that, tend to form a whole new monastery with a new abbot, things like that, right? Eventually, they might form a prior, which is kind of subject to that abbey, which hopefully is eventually going to become an abbey or something like that, right? Whereas for communities like us, like the Dominicans, Franciscans, Jesuits, Legionaries of Christ, we just start forming provinces and big structures like that. And this is talking more about these monasteries where, let's try and unite them in some kind of federation, right? For example, there is the American Cassinese Benedictine congregation where they have the rule of St. Benedict, then they have the rules for that congregation, and then from that, they have further rules in those things, right? And that's important, right, to say for each community, right? And that's important. Now, that's an example of this working out, right? And so those are kind of things where you can have the federation. Like when I was at Belmont Abbey College, the abbot of Belmont Abbey had gone a few times to visit other communities when they were electing an abbot, or, they'd go and visit them every so often to make sure everything was going well. And that's a good thing, right? And then it's also good to unite when they're small, and also it could be dividing if they're too big, because certain communities are certain sizes that are really good. The Carmelites have a specific rule that they can't go over 20, for example. And, these federations could also be apostolate and things like that. So these are generally good things to have federations to kind of unite these otherwise independent monasteries. So that concludes today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you could donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we're going to continue with the last paragraphs of Prophetic Caritatis, 23 to 25, on conferences of religious and a conclusion to the document. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan.
Amen.